Hi friends, welcome. This is our first video on US history. We're talking about the 16th century today when this land was neither united nor states. By the way, this globe shows that I believe Alaska's statehood is illegitimate. We're calling this show US history, but it will involve other parts of the world and even a small part of the moon. Sorry, we can be a little self-aggrandizing here in America. In this part of history, we won't talk about the United States or Europeans. We're going to talk about the people who lived here before any Europeans showed up. Native North Americans. North America was home to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. When the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. Native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals. However, they did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks. Were Native North Americans primitive? Primitive is a funny word, me from the past, because it implies a romanticization. These simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns. It also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized. That's not just Eurocentric, it's contemporary-centric. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that doesn't reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine yourself as the result of millennia of advancement and the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. Life in pre-Columbian America. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or incessant international meddling. Okay, it was nothing like NATO actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's lifestyle, hunting tribes focused on animals, agricultural tribes on good harvests. Most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans. To First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone. As Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence, and so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil." Thanks, Thought Bubble. Many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but there were class distinctions in Indian tribes. Rulers tended to come from the same families. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. While most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning children became members of their mother's family. Women were often important religious leaders and owned dwellings and tools, although not land because that idea didn't exist. In many tribes, women engaging in premarital relationships wasn't taboo. They were much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore this part of the world. Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in what is now Florida in 1513, looking for gold and the fabled Fountain of Youth. In 1521, he encountered a Calusa Brav's poison-tipped arrow and died before discovering that the Fountain of Youth is, of course, delicious, Diet Dr. Pepper. I can taste all 23 flavors. There were many more Spanish explorers in the first half of the 16th century, including one Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wandered through the American Southwest looking for gold, which I mentioned entirely because I think that guy's last name means cowhead. None of these people found any gold, but they did make later European colonization easier by bringing over the microbes that wiped out most native populations. The native people, who the Spanish called pueblos, had seen their fortunes decline significantly since the arrival of Europeans. Between 1600 and 1680, their population went from about 60,000 to about 17,000. The Franciscan friars who came to convert the indigenous people became increasingly militant about stamping out all native religion. The Spanish Inquisition just wasn't very keen on the kind of cultural blending that made early conversion efforts successful. While the Spanish saw all the pueblos as one people, they also knew there were tribal differences that made it difficult for the Indians to unite and rise up against the Spanish. But nothing unites like a common enemy, and in 1680, a religious leader named Pope organized an uprising to drive the Spaniards out. Pope organized about 2,000 warriors who killed 400 Spanish colonists and forced the rest to leave Santa Fe. The Spanish colony in New Mexico was effectively destroyed. The pueblos tore down all the Christian churches and replaced them with kivas, their places of worship. But like most awesome uprisings, it didn't last. After the revolt, the Spanish were much more tolerant of indigenous religion, and they abandoned the forced labor practice called encomienda. This realization is a good thing, but it leads us to one of the big problems when it comes to studying this time and place. The Black Legend is the tale that the Spanish unleashed unspeakable cruelty on the Indians. Now that tale is true, but that idea was used by later settlers, especially the English, to justify their own settlements. Part of the reason they needed to expand their empire was to save the Indians from the awful Spanish. But were the English so much better? Probably not. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, American Indians didn't have writing, so we don't have records of their perspective. Some Europeans like de las Casas were critical of the Spaniards, but most considered the Indians heathens, and, implied or outright, said they deserved whatever horrible things befell them. So, at the beginning of our series, I want to point out something we need to remember throughout. One of the great things about American history is that we have a lot of written sources. This is the advantage of the US coming onto the scene so late in the game, historically speaking. But every story we hear comes from a certain point of view. We always need to remember who is speaking, why they are speaking, and especially which voices go unheard and